Glory Cloud Podcast, episode 50. Well, stay tuned for an exciting interview this week. Well, welcome back to another episode of the Glory Cloud Podcast. I'm your host, Chris Cahy, and I'm joined by our co-host, Charles Lee Irons. Welcome back, Lee.
Hello, Chris. It's great to be with you again.
I'm really looking forward to the interview we have lined up this week. Before we dive right into that, I will just run through our regular housekeeping, reminding our listeners that we have a show notes page over at meredithkline.com/podcast. You can find all of the resources that we mentioned in the course of an episode there. And if you have not rated us on iTunes, we would sure appreciate it. If you would, it really helps people find good theological content when they're searching in iTunes. There's a link on the show notes page when you click on an episode that takes you right to the place where you can leave that feedback. And we've been mentioning for the last few episodes that in episode 50 here, we're going to take a break and that we will be back after that break, shortly after Thanksgiving. So while we're on the break, if you have the means and you would like to pitch in to help us cover the cost of hosting the audio files, I think we're covered through the end of 2017. But if you would like to help us out with that, there is a donate button at meredithkline.com/podcast on the right-hand side of the page there. And just to give our listeners some encouragement about the progress of the show, we currently have 52,702 downloads, and we are being listened to in 56 countries around the world, including all 50 of the United States.
Wow.
So
that's incredible,
isn't it? Well, this week we are very excited to welcome the Reverend David W. Inks to the show. David began his MDiv at Westminster Theological Seminary in Philadelphia. He studied there from 1976 until 1980, and he got married and then finished up his MDiv at Westminster Seminary, California, studying there from 82 to 83. He contributes to the Cultural Mandate by restoring two 1970s novas, and he does not own a cell phone. Pastor David Inks is currently the senior pastor of Covenant United Reformed Church in Clovis, California. Welcome, Pastor Inks.
Thank you. It's good to be with you.
I'm really looking forward to talking with you. I think you've got a lot to teach us and a lot to share with us. Lee, do you want to lead the way here?
Yeah, so Pastor David, we want to really focus our conversation today on some of your insights that you've developed through preaching through the book of Job. But before we get into Job, I wanted to just quickly raise an issue with you. I wanted to bring up an article that you published in Ordained Servant a few years ago. I believe it was in 2012, with the provocative title Calvin's Kline. And I'd just like it if you could give us a little bit of a brief synopsis of what you were trying to do in that piece.
I kind of had a simple target in mind. It arose out of a controversy that was in the Presbytery of the Northwest of the Orthodox Presbyterian Church at the time, and it had to do with that doctrine of Republication.
Yes.
Yeah, which Meredith Kline was well known for. And basically, I had unequivocally aligned myself with Kline's perspective on that and wanted to contribute some of my thoughts and hope that both sides would be willing to read it, maybe be influenced by it. And one of the contentions was that Kline was novel in his perspective. And what I wanted to show out of the reading that I'd done in Calvin, particularly the Institutes at that time, is that he was anything but novel, and that he was truly a successor of John Calvin's perspective on the law, on what I would call publication, which, with regard to the Mosaic Covenant, put Calvin and Kline on the same page. And the reason I say publication in Calvin, because Calvin didn't seem to have a really developed idea of the covenant of works in Adam. But he did have a very strong developed covenant of works in the Mosaic economy. And what I wanted to do in that article is I wanted to make those connections and dismiss the idea that Kline was novel, and that rather than being novel, he was a real true successor of the law grace dynamic that was part and parcel and foundational to Calvin's own theology. And so that's why I called it Calvin's Kline. Trying to be kid. And I was also trying to make a point right out of the chute there. So there's two things I connected up. One thing I connected was that Calvin taught that, and particularly Leviticus 18:5 and other places, that Moses taught a republication of the covenant of works. Now, he doesn't always say covenant of works, but the law is there as the foundation through which a person can gain eternal life or suffer the results of breaking them, which is eternal death. And so that was one thing I wanted to nail down. That was the trajectory from Calvin right to Kline. But also, Calvin also recognized that the sanctions, the blessings and cursings of the Old Testament had a temporal application. But in their temporal application, they also look forward to an eternal blessing and cursing as well. And so not only do you see a republication principle active and fundamental in Calvin, but also he has the typological framework as well in which how he understood it to work. Now, again, it's not as thoroughly developed as Kline is on either of those, but definitely clearly developed and clearly connected and anticipatory of Kline's further work developed on that. So that's what I was after. I was after one point: Kline is not novel.
Well, I thought you did a fantastic job in that piece. I was really impressed with your work, and I just thought it was to me, it's just so clear in Kline. Or in Calvin. I don't understand why there are so many people out there that try to claim Calvin on the other side as if he, is rejecting a law gospel contrast, as if for him it's all grace. He clearly sees the priority of law. He clearly sees the Pauline principle, of Romans 2:13, that the doers of the law will be justified. The problem is that no one does the law,
Exactly.
And so it's just so clear, and you just nailed it, I thought. And so I'm really glad you wrote that piece, and I'm glad that it got published.
Well, thanks a lot. There's one little line of thought that I really just didn't have space for in the article, and that is that Calvin clearly speaks of Moses in a narrow sense and Moses in a broad sense.
Mm-hmm, right.
And now you have to really get that in a pronounced way. You need to go into his commentaries on Romans 10 and then in the Pentateuchal parts. But that twofold distinction by saying that Moses narrowly was a minister of law, but broadly also ministered the gospel. Isn't quite the same as Historio Salutis and Ordo Salutis, distinction through which Kline analyzes it, but it's very compatible with it, and again, completely anticipatory. And I followed this up later when Mark Collingridge and McNeill wrote for our presbytery at that time in the Northwest a really nice 150-page historical piece on republication. And I had an appendix in there called What John Calvin Really Said. And, of course, I'm, poking fun kind of at N.T. Wright's what Paul really said. But I was, in that piece, I was seeking to take on a review of the Laws Not of Faith by Dr. Benham of Mid-America and his understanding of Calvin, because his assessment was that if you put Calvin, Witsius, and Turretin in order as representatives of Orthodox Reformed theology, you'll have to conclude that Kline's construct cannot be found there. And what I did is took him to task on that first pillar, that is Calvin himself, the oldest one. And I attempted to show definitively that Calvin's understanding of the law-grace contrast, particularly as it comes to focus in a single verse, Leviticus 18:5, was just the way that Kline had understood it, and just the way the bulk of Reformed theology has always understood how that verse works. That it's a covenant of works principle. So
it ultimately goes back to Paul, because Paul's the one that made such a big deal out of Leviticus 18:5. Yeah.
So I just went through the institutes and I went through the commentaries, to bring this forth and set forth that argument in opposition to Benham's construct, because the men that were favoring the anti-Kleinian perspective had that posted on the website as an example of a good critique of the Laws Not of Faith and concerns there with regard to republication, and of Kline himself, being the argument that this perspective is all traced back to Kline, not all traced back to historical Reformed theology. Which I think was in that argument again, I think is entirely unsupported from the sources. So, but anyway,
well,
that was it.
We will definitely link to that in the show notes page so that our listeners can find it and read it. I'd like to begin to turn toward a discussion of Job, and so. When we talk about republication, we tend to focus on the Mosaic covenant, but I'm wondering how the book of Job fits in that conversation. Do you see him as a post-Mosaic figure under the Sinai covenant of works, or is the works principle in Job a sort of vestige of the Adamic covenant? How do you understand that?
Yeah, that question's a real mental scrambler for one big reason, and that is that Job, I think, was written probably in some context of the Solomonic wisdom period, and therefore, in terms of its actual composition, is post-Sinai. But in terms of the person being discussed, Job, he is outside the parameters of the promised land and outside of the confines of distinctive concerns of the binding nature of the Sinaitic covenant. So on one hand, the answer to that question is no, he's not somehow intentionally under the Mosaic covenant so as to be an extension of it. Yet, on the other hand, there is no doubt in my mind, which you'll probably hear about it later, that the covenant of works is operative in Job and fundamental to understanding Job. If you're going to really get a good Christological read from Job. So, no doubt, you have bleed over from the fact that it's written in the Solomonic wisdom period, I think, of concerns that are of the covenant of works, that there's blessing for obedience, there's cursing for disobedience, and the way of securing life is through obedience to God and through righteousness. So.
Okay, well, that's helpful. So let's get into it then. So overall, how do you approach the book of Job? Do you think that we should interpret the book of Job at the level of the Ordo Salutis, where you look at Job as a Christian, in quote marks, as a pious believer who's trying to obey God? Or do you think that we should look at the book of Job from the perspective of the Historia Salutis, where Job ultimately is a type of Christ?
Well, I think insofar that Job is a book of wisdom, wisdom would dictate that we grasp both, one in each hand. For example, if I was to look at the life of Joseph, I can read the life of Joseph and glean much about suffering, glean much about trusting in the Lord, glean much at the end, about forgiveness of those who mistreat you, and all those aspects. You can read it that way, and you can, you might say in many ways identify with Joseph in life or anyone else and benefit from it. But ultimately, in terms of where the text and where the Old Testament, where the individual text, books of the Old Testament are headed, is they're headed toward Christ. So if you're going to come forth with the rich Christocentric wisdom that is there in the Word of God, there is no doubt in my mind that just as if you would read the story of Joseph, you would see Christ in that he was cast down low, raised up high, and through him a great deliverance occurred through his many sufferings. And with Job, you also have an absolute, unquestionable expectation and typological setting of Christ. And really, I don't think it's all that hard to get to. If you just simply pick up a good outline, and when I say a good outline, I guess I might as well let the cat out of the bag here. Is that David Dorsey's literary structure of the Old Testament, I believe, has nailed the chiastic outline of the book of Job for us. And in that outline, he shows that Job has a matching prologue and epilogue. And the prologue of Job is walking us into Job's sufferings. And the epilogue is walking us into glory. It's walking us into, a double blessing, it's said there. And so you can, if you believe Luke 24, where Jesus said that the Old Testament anticipated him in his sufferings and glory, then, hey, the book of Job is right there. It has sufferings and glory built in to its prologue and epilogue. So right there should give us a very strong clue that Job is about Christ. And there's more to it than that of course, but that should be an initial clue and pointer that this book is ultimately about Jesus Christ. And I can say some more a little later about how some of those components fit together. But that's the match.
Okay, so the structure is indicative of its Christocentric nature.
Yes.
Okay.
Insofar, the Lord Jesus said that the Old Testament spoke of his sufferings and glory, Luke 24.
Okay.
That's exactly what you see Job is about, suffering and glory. And, of course, spiritual combat, and we can develop more of that, but that certainly is introductory. And that's just the literary shape of the book. Its initial prologue, chapters 1 and 2, and then its epilogue, chapter 42, verse 17.
That's good. I like that. It just kind of occurred to me just as you were talking that we already have this category in the Old Testament of the righteous sufferer, especially in the Psalms. I mean, just leave out Job. In the Psalms, you clearly have that category. And, really it's David. And we already know that we should interpret the Psalms, and specifically the Davidic Psalms, as typological of Christ. Jesus himself, quotes Psalm 22 from the cross. So we have that category already. And then what you're saying is that Job is just another example of it, that maybe it's from a different time frame or from someone outside of the covenant, but it's the same it's the same way of thinking. It's the same structure of thought, where you have the righteous sufferer who suffers unjustly, cries out to God for vindication, and then he's vindicated and receives the exaltation at the end. Yes,
yeah, and then the other thing that is so accented in Job, and we'll get into this, but to the point that it boggles your mind, is the theme of his righteousness and how significant Job's righteousness factors in to the storyline of the book itself. That is from the get-go to the middle and to the end. I mean, from the get-go, God is saying to Satan, hey, as you're out there surveilling the kingdom of darkness, hey, I wanted to point this one shining star out to you. What do you think? Here's a man who fears God and turns away from evil. And we're off to the races. I mean, there's where Kline talks about the trial by ordeal. So let's settle this by, putting Job through his paces. And, God says that Job is gold. Satan is saying, no, he's fool's gold. Underneath the veneer, underneath the cushy life you hedged him in with, is the real sinner. You just need to be able to peel it back. And so there we go with the trial by ordeal, seeking to peel back, some of the soft parts that make him comfortable, so as to ostensibly expose what he's really made of and who he is. And that's the trial by ordeal.
So Satan is questioning the genuineness of Job's righteousness.
Absolutely.
And saying that his righteousness is actually a false piety, where he's just doing all these good things because you blessed him, but as soon as you stretch out your hand and take away everything that he has, then he's going to curse you.
Yeah, it's a nice fire insurance policy. And God Himself is paying the premiums. I mean, how good can it get? So that's the trial by ordeal in the very beginning that sets the stage for the entire book. And
so, in your view, Job's righteousness comes through that trial and comes out gleaming as a genuine righteousness.
Exactly.
And that's how you get that's how you get him to be a type of Christ.
Well, that's further how it gets into the type of Christ is the priority that righteousness is required for glory. And righteousness is required to defeat Satan. I mean, how was Adam initially supposed to defeat Satan? It's through his obedience I mean, how does Christ ultimately defeat Satan and win glory? It's through his obedience. How does Job show forth that same thing? But it's through his righteousness, he does prevail. He defeats Satan because, God drew Satan into this whole thing. And now I think you can safely say he's dismissed by the end of the book. And not only is he dismissed, but God vindicates him, that is Job, in the end of the book. And then Job, because of his righteousness, he's qualified to mediate at the altar for his three friends and achieves glory. Now, it looks like to me we're beginning to fill out more and more who Jesus Christ is, I think.
So, David, can you walk us through the main sections of the book and show us how the narrative of the whole book of Job, the narrative arc, fits together? Yes.
And this is where Dorsey is so helpful on the literary, the literary structure of the Old Testament, his section on Job. And it's only 6 pages, but man, out of 6 pages, you get so much in terms of how you approach the book. And essentially, there are 7 chiastic sections to the book of Job. Chapter 1 and 2, suffering matches with the end with glory. And then you have the middle of this literary piece, which is chapter 28. And chapter 28 has in the middle of chapter 28 the question, which is the question of the book of Job. Where is wisdom found? So chapter 28 is in between 2 other small portions, or larger portions, I mean. Chapters 4 through 27, of course, preceding it, is the cycle of debates between Job and his friends. But then on the other side of 28, matching that, is the discussions of Job, chapter 29, through 37, with his other friend, Elihu, steps into the picture. So those become matching sections. Chapters 4 through 27, the 3 friends in Job. Chapters 29 through 37, Job and Elihu comes on the scene. They match up with each other. All right, then the other sections that match up in the chiastic arrangement of the book is after chapters 1 and 2, and the 3 friends come and see who him is, see his condition, and they sit there in silence and amazement in his condition. We have chapter 3. And chapter 3 is the initial speech by Job, where he just essentially wishes he was dead. Not only was he cast down, but he was in the dark as to why he was cast down. And Kline's commentary in the Wycliffe Bible Commentary pointed out something I really appreciate. And that is, Job said that God has hidden his way from him, and that God had hedged him in. So there it is. He's hedged in by God, and it's hidden as to why he's hedged in. Well, that same word for being hedged in is Job is suffering God's displeasures, you might say, God's trials and difficulties in his life. That same word for being, as he says, he's hedged in by God, is what Satan said to God in chapter 1 and 2, that God, you've hedged him in with a cushy life. And so Satan is saying to God, you've hedged him in with this cushy life. And now in chapter 3, after Satan has unloaded both barrels, he says, God, you've hedged me in with a cursed life. It's so bad, I wish I were dead. So chapter 3 is very significant chapter about Job's assessment, discouragement, and looking at a life that is hedged in by God's curse, but also is hidden as to why it's hedged in. Now, the matching part chiastically with that, and this is an amazing point. The matching part chiastically with that is when God comes in chapter 38 through 42 with the two belt wrestling contests with Job, because not only does it match chiastically, but get this. There's about 60 words that Job employs in that third chapter that are all taken up in God's discourse in chapters 38 through 42 multiple times, so that there's about 140 matches between Job's life is meaningless and pointless, chapter 3, versus God coming on the scene and saying, who do you think you are? I've got this show under control, and I'm doing exactly what I intend to do, Job. And he reworks all of Job's vocabulary to the tune of 140 times. So not only do you have a chiastic match in terms of fitting the pieces of the book together, but you have this literary wisdom interjection where God takes Job's foolishness and brings it in and through his wisdom re-employs those words to make it completely different. It's a divine thing on all of Job's different. So in terms of walking through the book, once you see it chiastically arranged, and of course Dorsey does that, matching up the beginning, the epilogue, and prologue, matching up Job's speech then with God's speech, matching up Job and his three friends with Job and Elihu, and then seeing chapter 28 as the center. Where is wisdom found? Men are searching for wisdom. Where do you find it? And chapter 28, it's been kind of, gets tossed around a little bit about, that doesn't belong in there. It seems to fit awkwardly. But once you see how the book is lined up chiastically, you see, well, that's the center of the book, and that's its own standalone authorial poem. It's not Job's talk. It's not any of his friends' talk. It's the author now coming in and establishing this centerpiece on wisdom. Now, I assume that the listeners know the basic flow of the story. Chapters 1 and 2, Job suffers. Chapter 3, he announces his way being hedged in and hidden by God. I wish he were dead. I have a sermon on that chapter, which I call Your Worst Life Now. One of my favorite sermon titles. And then chapter 4 through 27 is what's going on in those chapters. Essentially, what's going on is this. The three friends find Job in the ash heap, but now they're putting him on the spit, and they're going to turn him around to every side of it with one thing they're after. Job, look. God rewards the righteous, and he judges the wicked. But even, the righteous sometimes need to repent. So Job, look, you've fallen away, come under the Lord's displeasure. Come out, Job. Come on. Come out with admitting what's wrong. Confess. And that's really all of chapters 4 through 27 is they're working him over. They are seeking to find the chink in Job's armor of righteousness and to get him to cough up a confession with the sense of confidence the Lord will restore. Just come clean. And of course, Job is resistant throughout this inquisition of his three friends turned into prosecuting lawyers. I remember when I took the class by M.M. Kline back in 83, Meredith Kline's son. He called the three counselors nouthetic counselors. And so I've kind of advanced that, and I said the three nouthetic counselors gone to seed. So, in other words, they can't let go of the single agenda of finding sin in your life and getting you to repent.
I appreciate that.
Yeah. As they attempt to work Job into a confession of some sort, it finally sputters out in the shortest chapter of Bildad. He's the last one to speak. It's a mere 6 verses, and it's like Bildad. Everybody's exhausted and have done all they could. They can't get it, and Bildad kind of makes his last swipe in chapter 25. And he says this. He says, "Dominion and fear are with God. He makes peace in his high heaven. Is there any number to his armies? Upon whom does his light not arise? How then can man be in the right before God? How can he who is born of woman be pure? Behold, even the moon is not bright. The stars are not pure in his eyes. How much less man who is a maggot and the son of man who is a worm?" Now, if you look at that, and you just read it standalone, you'd say, man, Bildad was a great Calvinist. Matter of fact, all these guys were Calvinists. Nobody questioned whether God was the administrator of good and evil, and that doesn't even come into view. That's clearly assumed throughout, and you see this appearing time and time again. But now Bildad is just simply saying this: look, God is a great and holy God, and certainly man, the mere maggot that he is, the sinful thing that he is, if the moon and the stars even blush before God, certainly, Job, you've got something to work with to come up with a confession of some point of unrighteousness. Now, if I was to ask that to you right now, Chris or Lee, what would your answer be? I've
got plenty to confess.
Of course.
I mean, it's like I'm saying, I'm reading this, and I'm going, oh, okay. Job's going to say, "You got me." Yeah. I can't. That is so that is so pervasive and so comprehensive. I'm going to have to go ahead to admit, okay, I'm going to squeak out this little confession and own up. Now, that's what you would think. That's what you and I would do, existential. But the funny thing is, chapter 26, Job just pours on bitter sarcasm. He says, how have you helped him who has no power? That's sarcasm. How have you helped him? Evissy's compliment. How you saved the arm that has no strength. He's mocking. How you have counseled him who has no wisdom, and plentifully declared sound knowledge. With whose help have you uttered words? Whose breath has come out from you? You see, Job is saying, look, what spirit is speaking in you to give you such great wisdom that you just shared with me? Me, the weak, me, the foolish. Oh, that is just so amazing. It's utter brutal sarcasm is his response to it. And then Job goes on to talk a little bit about, in 26, about the greatness of God and how profound God is, how deep he is, and basically say, well, that's kind of common knowledge. And then in 27, okay, now look, 27 is right before 28. There's wisdom. 27 is kind of the end of the discussions between Job and his friends. And listen to what he says. As God lives, who's taken away my right. Now, as God lives is an oath. Elijah said to Ahab, as the Lord lives. That's an oath. As God lives, who's taken away my right, and the Almighty, who has made my soul bitter, as long as breath is in me, and the Spirit of God is in my nostrils, my lips will not speak falsehood, my tongue will not utter deceit. Far be it from me to say that you are right. I'm not going to lie, it says. I am not going to lie. I'm not going to go ahead and cave in and say, oh, yeah, I guess I did say it. No, he says, I'm going to speak the truth. I'm not going to, make up some confession to satisfy you guys. Till I die, I will not put away my integrity from me. I will hold fast my righteousness. I will not let it go. My heart does not reproach me for any of my days.
Wow.
Now, if you've been reading the book of Job all along, and you go, okay, God assigns Job to have suffering. Oh, that's like in my life. God assigns me to have suffering. When things get really rough, God looks up at Job, or Job looks up to God. He says, the Lord gives, the Lord takes away. Blessed be the name of the Lord. Yeah, that's what I need to do when I have suffering and trial in my life too. And then you move into Job chapter 3. I wish I were dead. Oh yeah, I know I felt that way a lot of times. I wish I were dead. I really relate to Job. He's really, my heart's really resonating in here. I wish I were dead sometimes. Life gets so hard. And then you're faced with your three friends, right? And yeah, I know what friends are like. Yeah, as soon as things fall apart, they're all criticizing you and jumping on you. Yeah, I can relate to Job. But then as you go through those cycles of those three friends, you start feeling uneasy. You start feeling uncomfortable. Because Job is defending his righteousness throughout. And you're kind of getting queasy. And then you come to chapter 27, and he comes out with this, right? And you're saying, wait a minute, this isn't me. At the end of the day, I cannot say, I'm not going to lie. I'm going to speak the truth. My righteousness, I will not let go of it. My heart does not reproach me for any of my days. At that point, you say, I got to get off the Job train.
I can't say
I'm
that.
no longer resonating. See, right there, to me at that point, the whole staying true to reading Job only with the spectacles of the Ordo Salutis begins to fall apart. It really does.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it does.
And then, so then chapter 28 asks the question, okay, friends have worked him over and over and over, pulled him out of the ash heap and put him on the spit, shot arrows into him, lit up the fire. Job says, no. Chapter 28 says, wisdom to be found. Not to be found in the friends, it says. Doesn't seem to be found in Job. It says he's not coming forth explaining what's going on. Right? Just saying, hey, I would like God to answer. It says, I like God. I'd like to have a day before God. I could, have him confront me. Tell me what's going on. So chapter 28, then, of course, is that little, I think rightly, Cable, his commentary, Dorsey recognized that that's an authorial, interjected, strategically centered. Where's it's a wonderful little poetic piece about miners digging in the ground, swinging back and forth in shafts as they're lowered down into the ground, looking for gold, jewels. And this is man looking for wisdom. Miners. Where can and then it ends. He said to man, behold, the fear of the Lord, that is wisdom. To turn away from evil is understanding, is the end of that thought. And you go, okay. Understand. But Job's not done talking. Because in 27, he said, I'm not going to budge. I'm not going to lie. righteousness. Then in chapter 29, Job goes over his past life, how great it was, how he was recognized to be a wise man, how young men look up to him and come to him for counsel. He would be admired. He would help those who were in trouble. He was just a model person, and his life was just great. And then chapter 30, he says, but now they laugh at me. Men who are younger than I, whose fathers I would disdain, to set with the dogs. So chapter 30 says, everything's turned around now. My whole world has fallen apart. The roof has crashed in upon me. And he ends it at chapter 30 with, my lyre is turned to mourning. My pipe voice goes. That's right. Then chapter 31. Now this is, to me, an utterly mind-boggling chapter. Not only in Job, because in this chapter, Job finishes everything he's got to say. Because when you come to the end of chapter 31, it says the words of Job are ended. In chapter 30, you get introduced to life. But chapter 31, Job strikes up a covenant. Here it goes. He strikes up a covenant. I have made a covenant with my eyes. How then could I gaze at it? He goes on. That's a lot of people take that verse. I think they use it. Those who are battling cannot make a covenant. Covenant on program, develop purity. But this covenant is not just merely with his eyes. This covenant, as you see, has to do the entire life. And one of the commentaries I used was the Expositor's Bible commentary. You have Elmer Smick on Job. And in Smick's commentary on chapter 31, he does a really nice job of organizing the chapter outline. And basically, to cut to the chase here, what he shows is Job takes on 14 oaths of self-malediction. If in any way he has not formed the righteousness that he should, or that in any way is deviating. And Smick shows that these 14 oaths of self-malediction are divided into two. First, there's 7 oaths of self-malediction. Then he takes on 7 more oaths of self-malediction. And it says, on the basis of these, if I am not righteous, then may the appropriate cursing that would match any potential violation that he's taken oath, may they fall upon me. Like one of these, may my arm be pulled out of his side. If in any way he's been unfaithful regard to his wife, may other men have my wife. And on and on. I mean, it's very graphic and grueling to think that here's a man who's taken upon himself these oaths of self-malediction. And the way I see it, as he develops one body, then develops the other body. So, to me, that's reminiscent, and I could be going out. But to me, it's reminiscent, the dividing of in half to enter into a covenant. So he divides those oaths. So Job is as it is, if I say, walking. He winds up ending this chapter 31 in these 2 sets of 7 oaths of self-malediction with signing his name to it. He says in verse 35, "Oh, that I had one to hear me. Here is my signature." And it's the word mark, which has to do with documents or sign. Here's my signature. So what is Job doing? He's taking the oaths, taking a covenant of works, a covenant that can only result in vindication is if his righteousness completely holds. And he signs it. He adds his name to it. And then he says, "Oh, that I had the indictment written by my adversary." You see what Job is saying? He's saying, may God return the favor. May God bring his indictments to me. Because Job is viewing God as his adversary, the one who's lined up against him. And it doesn't make sense. And he's confident, completely confident, that his righteousness before God. Now, that is utterly mind-boggling. What son of Adam can potentially make these kind of statements? And that's why, again, we're moving in terms of what this is all about, out of a simple ordo into a historio salus. Because there is only one man that has righteousness that functions on that level. And Job is obviously a type of him. Now, you get this even further as we go on. As he says, "Oh, that I had the indictment written by my adversary. Surely I would carry it on my shoulder. I would bind it on me as a crown. I would give him an account of all my steps. Like a prince, I would approach him." So Job is saying, let God bring his indictments to me. I will wear them as a crown and a robe like a prince or a king. And I'll wear them right into his presence. Now, I had to ask myself, what do I do with this hot potato? This is just over the top. And I think the only way you can go with this is a picture of Christ. Who is it that can wear the indictments of God safely into God's presence? Because he is underneath those indictments, sustained by his own righteousness. That's Jesus Christ. See, this is a picture of Christ and the confidence of his righteousness, accepting God's indictments upon himself that are not his, that do not belong to him, that are not true of him, but yet he will wear them in his presence. This to me is a picture of Christ, the truly righteous one, who takes our indictments upon himself and wears them into God's presence. And yes, Job is only the type, he's only the anticipation, for Christ is truly judged for them. Yet he emerges out of that judgment vindicated because of the inherent righteousness of Jesus Christ. And he emerges not only out from under that judgment, vindicated, but that is the means through which Satan is defeated on the cross, and that is the means through which Christ secures the inheritance of glory and of the kingdom of God. It's on the grounds of his righteousness, on the grounds of his obedience, a covenant of works. That's exactly what you see here with Job. This is a covenant of works, clearly, not a covenant of grace. And then it says, the words of Job are ended. What are you going to do with this now? Where is this going to go now? And then Elihu appears, of course, chapter 32 through 37. There's different views on Elihu's distinctive contribution. And I think Elihu is fundamentally a forerunner, clears up some issues, and then God appears in chapter 38 through 40. And as Kline, I think, rightly points out, we have now God himself calling Job into the trial by ordeal. For the simple fact that though Job's righteousness holds, he does overstep his boundaries, insisting on his own righteousness above vindicating God. And God calls his servant, Job, he calls him, into a belt wrestling contest. First, a wisdom contest with regard to creation itself. Were you there when they made all these things? Can you fathom all these things? And of course, God wins that fall of that belt wrestling contest. And then there's the second belt wrestling contest of do you have the power? The first one is you have wisdom. The second one, you have the power to conquer Behemoth and Leviathan. And it's my contention, and I think that this is really the only way to go, is Leviathan is a historically developed Satan just embedded in creation, powerfully embedded, evil, powerfully embedded in creation. And God is asking Job if he can extract him. And of course, Job in and of himself cannot extract him. But the amazing thing is, though Job is a weak man, due to his righteousness, he does defeat Leviathan. He does defeat the devil. And he does overcome. And not only does his righteousness win the contest, which began in the very beginning, but eschatologically, with regard to the judgment of God, which this appearance of the Lord is, it's kind of a precursor to final judgment. Satan is defeated as well because of that. And glory is achieved. So what you see in Job, I think, is the only way you can really begin to handle the weightiness of this whole discussion about his righteousness, is to see it Christologically. It's Christ. It's Christ. Not just that Christ suffered and Job suffered, but that Job anticipates that Christ's righteousness is thoroughly tested for its integrity. And not only is that righteousness thoroughly tested, but it is because of that righteousness he emerges victorious. Satan laying hold of and able to mediate at the altar. So that's, at the end of the day, I think if you look at Job this way, and this Christological framework, and particularly with regard to seeing this covenant of works theme is built in and foundational to understanding the dynamic of the book and of its Christocentric nature, I think you're on the right track of really mining riches.
Well, thank you, David. I think you're right on. I think that your emphasis on seeing the covenant of works in the book of Job, and then seeing the emphasis on righteousness and the testing of Job's righteousness as being critical to the book, and that being the means through which Job defeats the serpent. I think you're hitting on something that's a real precious vein of truth there, and I think you're really helping us to understand this book Christologically. I want to recommend, too, to our listeners, if they want to go to YouTube, Pastor David's sermons are up there on the, is it the Fresno URC? Is that the name of the YouTube channel?
If you just go to YouTube and type in my name, David, okay, it will pull up my sermons, and you have to hit the playlist and scroll down to around November 2015.
Yeah.
Because in that time frame, I give those 12 sermons on Job.
Yeah, there's one in November of 2015 titled Job's Covenant Contract Inked, which is on Job 31. And I found that sermon to be a tremendous blessing and very powerful. So I would encourage people to take a look at that.
Yeah, and I would encourage them, if they do take out time to look at that one, to also look at the very last one, because in the last one, I attempt to put it all together in the very last sermon.
Great. Can you share with us, you've already mentioned some of the materials and commentaries you've used, but can you just give us a brief rundown on your recommended reading on Job?
Yeah, I can only say this is what I used and found to be helpful. But I would say get two things for sure. One, get Dorsey's literary structure of the Old Testament. David A. Dorsey. I looked up Bookfinder. You can get those for about. You can have Amazon ship one to you for $28.50 total on Amazon Bookfinder. And then the other one is just a commentary by Hable. I think you'll find some things there you may not agree with, but in terms of a guy who's taken the text serious, trying to work with the text and tease it out, interpret it, man, it's a lot of good stuff in this commentary by Hable, part of the Old Testament Bible from Westminster Press. And of course, back there in the 1960s when the Wycliffe Bible Commentary was being put together, volume commentary, Kline had the one on Deuteronomy. He also had one on Job. Yeah, Kline and Job. Wycliffe Bible Commentary, which is, of course, here's your reading. And he has a statement here that I liked so much. I wrote it out and I put it up on my wall. Here it is, regarding the friends' discussions, trying to understand Job. It says, each builds on sand, on speculations drawn from the subjectivity of his own consciousness and the relativity of the changing world, rather than on the granite disclosures of the omniscient Creator. It's my favorite quote. Commentary on Job. And then I also, you can get an article in the Festschrift done for Dr. Philip Edgecombe Hughes, New Testament scholar. I had him in Westminster, Philadelphia, delightful fellow. And there's in this Festschrift, it's called Through Christ's Word by P&R, Presbyterian Reformed Publishing. There is an article on Job by Meredith Kline called Trial by Ordeal. He talks about the ordeal within the ordeal. Good stuff. That also, an oldie but goodie, William Henry Green, Conflict and Triumph. The Argument of the Book of Job Unfolded came out in 1874. Princeton Seminary, Old Testament prop. William Henry Green, Conflict and Triumph. That's a nice paperback read. Very engaging, easy to track with. Stimulating. And then if you're seriously stuck on seeing Leviathan as kind of a guise for Satan, kind of a developed Satan, I kind of said that Leviathan is the heavy plated Satan that initially appeared as a scaled serpent in the garden, that historically develops into a heavy-plated dragon. So if you're stuck on that idea, there is, in the New Studies in Biblical Theology series, edited by Carson, one on Job by Robert Fyall, Fyall. Now my eyes have seen you. Images of creation and evil of Job. I think he pretty well names that is the guise of Satan. And it's a doctoral dissertation, pretty dense stuff, but it all fits together quite nicely. Recommend that as well. And then, of course, the other commentary I recommend that I really like is out of the Expositor's Bible Commentary set. Job by Smink. So those are the things I'd recommend, and I'm sure there's other resources out there that are also useful. But it was truly Dorsey that started pointing me in the right direction. How to look at Job.
Okay. I appreciate you sharing that list with us. That'll be helpful for us and for our listeners. Can you tell us what you're working on now in terms of your preaching, and are you writing anything else these days?
I've been thinking of putting my sermons and redoing them into a little book. Those 12 sermons I did on Job. Kind of thought they had a distinctive interpretive contribution to make, and I've been encouraged to do that. So that may be my writing project. But in terms of other things, I've been preaching through Revelation. Got through chapter 9, hiatus, 2 Corinthians. I'm in the URC, so I do catechetical preaching, and then presently trying to camp on the church in a second.
Very good.
Excellent. How can people follow you online?
I would say just YouTube. Go to YouTube, type in my name, and good work there. And then see, there's also in iTunes. I guess you just put in FresnoURC.org. And there's a key word there of capital C, capital U, capital R, capital C. Covenant United Reformed Church.
Okay, and the sermons are there?
Yeah.
Okay.
Excellent.
Well, Pastor Inks, we really appreciate you taking the time to come on and talk to us. I've benefited a lot from what you've had to say.
Oh, great. Well, thanks. It's been a really thrilling spiritual journey for me, working through these themes in Job and trying to see how they all hang together. And it's kind of been many years in the making, actually. I just kind of rolled kind of been gurgling around. It certainly has been thrilling and edifying to be able to preach through it and to share it tonight.
Very good. Lee, anything else before we wrap up?
No, I just wanted to say that I really appreciate you taking the time to go through these things with us and to give us a nice little summation of all your thoughts on how to interpret Job Christologically. So it's great.
You're welcome. I hope they begin to point people in the right direction. There's a lot more trajectories that can be made, but I hope this kind of begins giving some formative perspective for people to run with.
Oh, absolutely.
Okay. Well, thank you again. Thanks to our listeners for listening to us for 50 episodes now. If you haven't listened to all of them, then this break that we're about to take will give you time to get caught up. And so enjoy the break, and we will see you again shortly after Thanksgiving. See you then. Bye.